Now, I know all of you have very pressing matters on your hands right now with all the changes going on and the general state of disarray, but I'd like to take you on a journey with me in order to dream a little and learn a little, hopefully, about how AI can save the world. So more specifically, the aspect of the world that really needs saving is climate change. So as you know, it's one of the biggest challenges that humanity is facing. It's a global problem. It's going to impact everywhere and everyone in one way or another, be it through wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, you name it. Chances are either you or the food you eat, the places you travel to, all of these things are going to change in the next years and decades. Some places are going to be more impacted. Here's a map of Canada in terms of precipitation change. So you see that some areas are going to get more affected than others. It's often not actually the people who are polluting the most that suffer the consequences the most. So it brings about a lot of these issues, and it's actually a pretty complex problem in itself, climate specifically, because there's so much going on. It's so hard to predict. It's so hard to represent, and so there's all these like moving pieces to this problem. Actually, climate change has been defined as a wicked problem. Now, what is a wicked problem? It's actually pretty interesting. So it means that not only is it hard to define, so people actually fight about what climate change is. Is it global warming? Is it, is weather and climate the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. So already we're having trouble defining it. We're having trouble developing a solution to it because there's so many solutions. It's like a never ending thing, right? You can reduce something here. Some people want to absorb carbon from the air and put it underground, but is that really a solution? Or are we going to keep polluting? Are there things we can do and we can't do? So there's all these like questions that come up. And it's also really hard to assess how well you're doing, because it's kind of like whack-a-mole. You have something that's going well and you're like, oh, hey, this is getting better. And then on the other hand, you see that there's a feedback loop that's happening and something that you didn't predict. And there's no opportunity to learn by trial and error, because we essentially only have one shot at this, and we actually don't even know what the timeline is. So obviously we have to act now, but how now is now, or in 6 months from now, or in 10 years from now. So there's always kind of this sense of it's going to be tomorrow's problem, which is also a problem with regards to political leadership, because people get elected for a certain amount of time. And since climate change is never the most urgent problem, there's always unemployment, there's always, economy, etc., pandemics. Climate change always tends to take the back seat on this. So now we're starting to get some momentum, but historically speaking, this has been it in terms of climate change and then taking action. People have started to realize more and more that it's going to hurt the economy. So there's huge losses of GDP projected. For example, Canada, if there's 4 degrees of global warming, stands to lose something like $45 billion a year come the year 2100. And also hypothetically speaking, if we were to limit warming to 2 degrees, we could actually gain $17 trillion, which is a ridiculous amount of money, just because we're mitigating these eventual like kind of hypothetical future losses that we can have. So I mean, there's like a certain economical aspect to this, and people are starting to realize that it's going to, investment banks have started saying, this is something that we have to focus on. There have been a few high-profile announcements in the last couple of months and years, and so it's like finally becoming clear to people that climate change is going to hurt people's wallets. It's really bringing it home. And on the other hand, it's going to actually create a lot of opportunities. So according to the US Statistics Labor Bureau, a wind turbine technician and solar panel installers are going to be 2 of the most highly sought after jobs in the coming years, because people are switching to renewables. There's demand for people to install them. And actually people are recognizing that, nature has a positive value, and that, for example, electric cars have potential, et cetera, et cetera. So there's actually investment and work opportunities that are being created. So that's kind of an introduction globally to the problem. And now in terms of climate change, why is it hard to act? Yeah, this is actually a really big thing. apart from the wicked problem thing, there's also kind of these like myths and things that people have in their minds. So for example, people always think that there's going to be a negative impact, for example, to scaling down, to keeping things more local, because you don't really know what's going to happen. You kind of overestimate how bad it's going to be. And also there are psychological factors and lobbies also that get in the way of things. So there's actually, like the oil and gas industry have a lot of money. So there's actually, players that are in the game that we don't even realize they're there. In terms of psychological factors, there's actually a lot of studies that have been done on these, not only in regards to climate change, but in general. And so, for example, out of sight, out of mind. If something is not in our direct field of view, we don't tend to think about it. And this is something that we've evolved to do because of, living in the savannah and hunting mammoths, and the tiger was in the bush. And so if the tiger's not in the bush, we tend not to think about the tiger. And so this kind of gets in the way of acting on climate change. Things that are far away. So like, for example, we always consider wars and hunger and things like that to be far away from us because it's never close to home. We always feel kind of protected from it. Same thing with things that are far away in time. Like if something happened 50 years ago, for us, it's like super long time ago, even if it's really nothing in terms of history. Also, abstract concepts are not people's forte. So if we start talking about, some hypothetical impact, some very vague terms like degrees of warming. What does that actually mean? Does that mean that like right now it's 10 degrees is it going to be 14 degrees? Is it going to be on average? Is it going to be higher and lower because more extreme events? So people can't really get their head around what it means when 4 degrees of warming. And so we underestimate the stakes on one hand, and also we have all these short-term economic issues, right? We have bills to pay, we have our jobs, we have things to take care of. So all of these things don't help. There's also a well-known phenomena that's called tragedy of the commons. So it's been discovered with regards to common resources. So for example, cows and grazing pastures. So if, for example, if everyone has their own pasture for their cows, they'll tend to be careful with it and take care of it and make sure that they never overconsume. But if there's a common pasture that doesn't really belong to anyone, people will really overuse it because they don't feel attached to it, right? It's common pasture. And so it's present in economics, sociology, ecology, and all these different domains. And actually it's very human of us. We tend to get attached to things that are ours, and then things that are common are just kind of not a priority for us. But this is an issue when it comes to drinking water, clean air, forests, and the like, just because it belongs to everyone, kind of like the oceans belong to everyone, right? They're an international kind of like resource. For example, overfishing is bad for everyone, but then people still tend to do it just because they want to have more fish. So this is also something that we're grappling with in regards to the climate crisis. Now AI and all this. So first of all, what is AI? So it's not only robots. Robots are an example, a material example of AI. It's not only killer robots. It's not only men programming their computers, white men as the stereotype goes. So these are all kind of like popular culture representations of AI, but it's actually none of these things. I mean, this is just kind of a simplification of what AI is. So actually, it's AI. I mean, there's many definitions, but one that I really like are methods and techniques for making machines capable of simulating certain traits of intelligence. So this means that we're not trying to create like a killer robot. We're not trying to create a super intelligence. Essentially, most of the time, we're trying to create robots that can do specific tasks or machines that can do specific tasks. And actually, historically speaking, it's been around since the 1950s with Alan Turing making the first machine that can think. And it was rule-based, so it was a lot of, if this, then that, for the longest time in the 50s and 60s, but with a lot of promises. So actually AI had kind of a first wave of progress, and then followed by what's called an AI winter, because AI didn't live up to the promises it made. So for example, a computer couldn't play chess as good as a human being until the 90s, right? And this is something that was promised back in 50s and 60s. They were saying, yeah, computers are going to beat humans in chess. They're going to do everything. So there was an AI winter. So people didn't work on it for a while. And then in the 1980s, 1990s, people started working on it. And that's mostly because of data and storage power and computing capacity. So basically, we're saving more data. We have more powerful computers that are more deployed in different places. So now we can actually use AI in a more robust way, not just by writing rules. And now there's a field, it's a subfield of AI called machine learning, which is really data driven. So you're not trying to make the data say anything, you're trying to learn from the data. So it's basically estimating models based on observation. So for example, you see images, you see text or numbers, and then you try to predict or classify or infer based on this. So basically I can see a lot of pictures of cats and dogs, train an algorithm, and then when the algorithm sees another picture of a chihuahua, even if it wasn't in the original set, it's going to say, well, this is a dog. If it learned the characteristics of what dogs are and what cats are, given enough data. So AI has been applied pretty much everywhere since machine learning came around. So now we're having really a new wave of AI. So recognizing and generating patterns is like a big thing. So facial recognition can be critiqued sometimes, but it can be used, for example, for biometrics. Also facial expressions, you can recognize people, how they're feeling. Medical imagery is a huge thing, detecting cancers almost as good as humans. Generating images and sounds. I don't know if you've seen those videos of, Donald Trump saying something he didn't really say, or Obama. And so people can actually generate images that are pretty realistic and sound as well. Recognizing anomalies and unusual behavior. So nowadays there's a lot less banking fraud because machine learning algorithms can detect when transactions like, oh, you don't usually spend $5,000 at the liquor store, so this is weird. So that's anomaly detection. There's also recommendation systems, which are pretty much everywhere, from Amazon, any kind of online shopping, YouTube. So they all try to recommend new content based on old content. So basically it can either be based on other people who have watched similar videos. So for example, I really like, nature videos. And so I'll watch a bunch of them, and then I'll keep clicking through them and first watch, Amazon, and then watch Antarctica, and then watch something else. And then so the computer will learn a pattern of clicks, and then David Attenborough, etc. And so if somebody else starts watching some of these videos, an algorithm can say, oh, well, Sasha already watched a bunch of these, so why don't I recommend one of the ones that Sasha watched? And then actually every time you skip a video, or you finish a video, or you share a video, or you post a video, all of this gets gathered, and this is why recommendation systems have gotten so good. There's also prediction. Recommendation system is kind of a prediction, but it's more personal, it's more individual. There's also predictions like the stock market, exchange rates, but also epidemics. So actually AI is now being used to track and predict for COVID-19. Also car accidents, for example, configurations of roads, or just panels on the roads and things like that can actually provoke car accidents. So machine learning is being deployed in situations like that to say, like, why is all of a sudden there's all these car accidents here? Well, actually it's because they built a new entrance to the highway 5 streets down, and now this is causing traffic jams, which causes a left turn, which causes accidents, for example. So AI can do lots of stuff. When can we use AI? So there's some cases where we can use it. It's definitely not a solution for everything. But often we use it when there's little or no human expertise. So for example, Curiosity rover uses a lot of AI because humans have never been on Mars. So for example, navigation on Mars is something that you need to learn new things. You can't just write rules like, follow this street, then turn right. No, you need to learn on the fly. So Curiosity rover uses a lot of AI. Sometimes in cases where we don't know how things are done, like in voice recognition. So can you really say what, when I say cat, and then I want my computer to recognize the fact that I said cat, how do I explain it to the computer that, those sounds constitute that word? What if I say it fast? What if someone has an accent? So voice recognition is actually a really great example, because you can have a ton of examples of different people saying cat, and then the computer will learn what constitutes the word, but without actually having to explain it. It's just a question of recognizing patterns. Also, there's a lot of tasks that the machines can accomplish more precisely. For example, sequencing the genome. it got sped up by I don't know how many times, just because we can use AI to recognize patterns and say, oh, well, we already saw this sequence before. Maybe I don't need to sequence it again. But on the other hand, machine learning models have to be adapted specifically to a given problem. So you can't just, train your algorithm on cats and dogs and then use it on, I don't know, bananas and pineapples. There are fields of AI called transfer learning, where it essentially involves, training on one set of data with 2 categories or 3 categories or however many, and then transferring to another set of data and implementing ways of transferring that knowledge without having to reprogram everything. But most machine learning applications are very, very specific to a given problem, which limits their application. And machine learning and deep learning. Deep learning is a branch of machine learning that actually has really, really deep, like big algorithms. So that's why it's called deep learning, just because there's a lot of layers. And so deep learning needs a lot of data. So we're talking about, hundreds of thousands of millions of examples in order to learn meaningfully. So once again, this is something that's being worked upon, improved upon. There are people who are working on few-shot learning or one-shot learning or distribution learning, et cetera, et cetera. But as is, if you want to train an algorithm to recognize, for example, 2 sets of butterflies, monarchs with not monarchs, you need to train from scratch, and you need thousands of images of both species. And then hopefully, if they're distinct enough, and you have enough images of them from different angles and on different backgrounds as well, because often, for example, an AI can cheat and say, okay, well, monarchs are, I don't know, for example, often this kind of plant or this like green around it, and this other butterfly that you want to classify lives in, for example, a desert, and it actually has a different background. And so, for example, the algorithm can just use the background to identify, and then you have this. And then if you switch and you put a monarch in the desert, it's never going to recognize it because just the context changed. So you have to also be careful in the way you train your data, train your algorithm, that it's focusing on the right things. So long story short, AI is great and powerful and all of that, but it's got its limitations, and you can't solve all the problems. Excuse me. So AI against climate change. Given everything that I've said so far, I was hoping that you all can take a few minutes to think. I know this is not an active, I'm not present with you, and I can't do some back and forth Q&A interactiveness that I would usually do, but I would want to give you the opportunity to think of potential applications of AI in the fight against climate change, starting from a blank slate before I tell you anything, just based on what I've said so far about Mars, about sequencing the genome, about facial recognition. So here's a bunch of different AI techniques. And I'm just based on these, very vague techniques, maybe try to think of a few applications in the fight against climate change that that AI can be used for. So I will give you a few minutes, let's say 2 minutes, and hopefully you'll come up with some of the applications, some applications around this. So for example, speech recognition. What can speech recognition be used for in the fight against climate change? How about future forecasting? How about image generation? So I'm going to be quiet right now and let you think a little bit. one more minute. I really wish I was there with you so you could ask me questions. Write them down maybe and send them to me at the end if ever I don't cover them in the next part of my talk. But this is also frustrating for me, believe me. So one more minute. All right. So hopefully you'll have some aha moments during the next part of my presentation because you thought of all these applications during this little brainstorming moment. But if not, you'll learn something new and maybe you'll get inspired. So in terms of approaches to climate change, there's two major ones in the literature. So one is mitigation, which is really trying to mitigate, to reduce things as much as possible, so reduce climate change as much as possible. And then there's adaptation, because obviously even if we stopped all emissions right now, there's still going to be some climate change going on, some global warming going on. So because of the gases that have built up in the atmosphere. And so even if we changed, if everyone stopped polluting right now, there's still adaptation to be done. So that's another branch. And then there's also kind of a third, less mainstream branch, which is awareness raising. So I'm going to talk about projects from all three of these branches, including my own, and hopefully give you a better idea of all the potential that exists in using AI to tackle climate change. So, oh yeah, so last year, a bunch of us, like 23 or so of us, came together and we wrote like a 100-page paper called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning. And I was super lucky to be part of this global effort with people from Harvard and Carnegie Mellon and Zurich and Berlin, Stanford, DeepMind, Google, Microsoft. For example, I don't know if any of these names ring a bell. Joshua Bengio, he's here in Montreal. Andrew Ng, he's in California. Demis Hassabis, he's in London. So all of these people came together and put their big brains together in order to figure out the different ways that climate change can be addressed with machine learning. So it's a pretty hardcore paper, but I'll try to give you some examples from it just to give you an idea. And also what we tried to do is we tried to create, like we call it a menu for action. So typically people in AI, because they're so used to working on like specific problems, like, I don't know, distinguishing cats and dogs or puppies and birds or whatever, they like having concrete problems that they can use an algorithm for and say, okay, now this works, and they want to be able to evaluate it. And obviously climate change is not like something you can just train a model on. You have to like break it up into little bite-sized pieces and then give people data and give people access to domain experts, for example, because they don't even know what to start with. So basically we kind of did some of this work for the community. We had these sections of the paper on the left. So we have electricity systems, transportation, buildings and cities, industry, farms and forests, CO2 removal, climate prediction, that's prediction, societal impacts, solar geoengineering, tools for individuals, tools for society, education, and finance. So I wrote the education and finance sections because my background, on one hand, my PhD was in using AI in education, and then I spent some time working in the financial sector. I left. But yeah, I do have some background in those two sections. And then in the columns, we have methods. So kind of like the ones I showed you in the previous slide. So we've got, like, for example, computer vision. This is like things to do with images. NLP is with text. Time series is predicting things in time. So basically based on today, I want to predict tomorrow. Unsupervised learning is when you don't have all the answers. When you have like just data, you have just like images and you want to categorize them without really knowing what the categories are. Reinforcement learning, et cetera, et cetera. So transfer learning, which I spoke of, when you train on one set of data and you apply on another set of data. So all these different techniques. And basically we were trying to show people like where it's dark is where there's a lot of things to be done. Where it's lighter, there's a bit less things to be done. But still we're trying to get people like to find their nexus. So if, for example, I really like transfer learning and I want to work on farms and forests. So you can go to the section and then see what can be done, what data exists, what's being done, et cetera, et cetera. So if this is something you want to get involved in, you can read the paper, and we actually have a website, climatechange.ai, I think. And then you'll see like different sections of the paper. And actually something that we really tried to do is identify things that were high leverage, like for example, that's like really high, potentially high impact, long-term or short-term, uncertain impact. For example, solar geoengineering is when you try to essentially change the climate using human intervention. So that's like, you know, uncertain, because we don't know if we put aerosols in the air in Canada, what it's going to do in Cambodia, for example. So there's things like that that uncertain. And then we have long-term and short-term, high risk, low risk. So basically we kind of did all this job, and then this is from our website. You can click on sections, read about what it means, and then explore. So in terms of climate modeling, so obviously climate modeling is a huge part, because what if we knew, so basically this is a graph of, you know, past and future climate. So we know what happened in the past. We know more or less what's happening in the future, but sorry, in the present, but in the future, everything diverges. So these are like a bunch of different models, essentially, and scenarios, simulations and scenarios, and then they diverge, especially from 2050 or so, because there's so many factors in play. There's so many things that can change. And so basically, if we could reduce this uncertainty as much as possible, well, we could kind of know what's coming. So we know that if, you know, global surface warms by 2 degrees by 2050, this is what we can expect, right? But we're not there yet. So AI can help, because typically the models that are used for these are these like huge statistical models that take like almost years to run, at least, you know, weeks and months to run. So AI can help improve the spatial resolution. So basically make them more specific, more downscaled, and also the power itself. So basically, you can take a bunch of models, kind of boil them down, and then make them better, reduce computing time, and then also learn online, because what happens now is that the model gets trained over weeks and months, and then it's basically static and people use it, but like new information is coming in every day, right? So currently online learning is not a thing that exists. So you can use AI in order to make sure that the model learns on the go. We have a really interesting project at Mila, where I work, which involves predicting clouds. And it may seem pretty petty, but clouds are actually a huge part of climate modeling, because they have such a big impact on climate. I mean, on weather and on rain and on, you know, all sorts of stuff. So basically, we're using features like location, temperature, wind speed, and wind direction, humidity, and reflectance in order to like model where clouds are going to be in the coming like minutes and hours. And that can actually give people hold on to this thought when we're going to be talking about energy, because this is going to come into play. But essentially, knowing where the clouds are even half an hour in advance, especially in places where they don't have radars, is really, really useful. I'll tell you what. Also, predicting extreme weather events is basically a no-brainer, right? You want to know where a hurricane is going, and how strong is it, and how liable is it to hit a certain very highly populated area. So there's actually an extreme weather data set that was created at Mila, and people are training algorithms on it to see how well they can predict like big weather events, like hurricanes and tsunamis, I think, things like that. Energy sources. So one of the big barriers to switching to renewable energy is actually prediction. So if you know where a cloud is, or where, you know, where you are, for example, you're building either a wind turbine or a solar power plant, you need to know where clouds are, because you need to be able to predict how much solar energy you're making. Because especially if you're powering a large grid with demand, you can't, like if there's a big cloud and all of a sudden you have no sun and your energy production goes down, basically what people do now is they power up diesel generators, which defeats the purpose of having renewable energy. So ideally, you would know that the cloud is coming, power up batteries instead, stock this energy, and then when the cloud comes, use that as a buffer to respond to the demand, because the demand doesn't stop just because there's a cloud. au contraire, people will turn on the lights more, right? So this is a huge barrier to renewable energy, and this is a lot of, I mean, this is a large reason why people still use coal. Is because like it's way too complicated to handle supply and demand in real time, because coal, you know that when you put X amount of coal, it's going to give a Y amount of energy, and you know, and you can always put more coal in and have more energy. But if there's sun or wind, it's hard to predict. So AI can help with that. For example, the cloud modeling project I referred to before, or other things, other predictions that can actually estimate the output of renewable energy sources. You can also estimate how much greenhouse gases factories generate, for example, based on satellite imagery. You can tax them, for example, because currently there's no tax depending on emissions. Like there's some tax of actually, you know, fuel, but there's no tax based on how much a factory emits, and actually there's almost no tracking of you know, industrial emissions, because it's so hard to do. Because how are you going to control a factory, because you don't know, you know, how much coal they're using, or if they have a generator or not, et cetera, et cetera. But using AI, you can actually analyze satellite imagery and say, well, this factory is emitting this much greenhouse gas. You can also predict electricity demand. So that's actually pretty contingent on temperature and time of day, and even like events like a pandemic or a Super Bowl or things like that. So that's actually a pretty, maybe for pandemics, it's a bit harder to predict because they don't they don't happen that often. But in terms of events, like, you know, that, you know, if the temperature goes down, people are going to heat more. If the temperature goes way up, people are going to put on the AC. So you can use AI in order to do these kinds of predictions. And then so essentially you have less uncertainty, and you have to power up less generators. And you can also minimize losses and cost of transportation of electricity, because here in Canada, we're pretty lucky. We have really, fairly good electric grids that are very safe and reliable. But in a lot of places, there's a lot of losses, for example, either in the ground or because of broken cables or frayed cables. And you can use AI in order to see where the losses are happening, either using like infrared imagery, or like modeling the grid system in order to see, well, the leak is here. We also have a project at Mila in synthesizing new materials for batteries. So actually, most of the batteries are suboptimal, right? Like the more you use them, the less they charge. Like phones, like electric vehicles, is a huge issue because, like for example, if I buy a used electric car that's been used for 2-3 years, most of the battery is probably not going to hold more than 50 kilometers. So you can't just have like optimal charging for 500 kilometers at each time. So AI can be used to synthesize new molecules that haven't been thought of yet, essentially, in order to potentially have more storage capacity, longer durability, et cetera, et cetera. So we have people working on this who are trying to like model molecules in 3D and use AI in order to like generate variations of molecules, and then you can do kind of like simulated testing on them and see how well they do, essentially, to hold the charge. So really, really useful if it works out, because you can be used in so many different ways. Transportation and industry. So predicting demand in order to improve urban infrastructures is pretty major, because, you know, there's a lot of traffic jams, there's a lot of suboptimal urban planning. And often if it was a bit more responsive and a bit more, you know, real-time tracking, and like if you're using webcams to say, oh, here's an accident, you know, turn on the lights here, 3 streets away, put on some green lights so people get rerouted. Like, we're all using Google Maps at this point anyway, right? So you can integrate that into kind of this like meta system that helps track predict demand. And actually in San Francisco, on one of the bridges, they have like a little robot, the one on the picture, that actually positions the divider based on demand. So currently it has people on it, but eventually the idea is like scan the camera footage, and essentially in like the space of a couple of minutes, just add a lane or remove a lane when needed, just by changing the divider automatically. So like things like that can make a really big impact, right? Also in terms of construction, buildings actually use a lot of electricity. Something like 20% of world's electricity is buildings, or even more than that. And there's a lot of ways of optimizing them. For example, just the way that they're designed, or sensors in rooms. So when you leave a room, the lights go off, or like if there's more people in a room, you can heat it less and things like that. So there's a lot to be done there. Also in terms of like industrial applications, a lot of greenhouse gases are produced in supply chain. So for example, shipping things back and forth. Like there's this anecdote in our paper that there were some shrimp that was caught in Scotland, off the coast of Scotland, that got shipped to China to be peeled and processed, and then shipped back to Scotland to be sold. Like things like that shouldn't happen, right? So AI can help optimize supply chains and do things locally. And same for ships, same for trucks, for example. There was a recent proof of concept in the port of Montreal where AI was used to optimize waiting times. So basically, trucks could say, "Oh, I'd like to pick up my whatever stock in the next couple of hours," and then essentially the system would say, "Okay, come now," or "Come in 5 minutes," and then it saved like a lot of CO2 just because trucks were not just like idly waiting to get their shipments in the port. In terms of cities, more broadly speaking, like there's a lot of things that can be done with satellite imagery. Google is doing this really cool thing where they estimate rooftop solar potential. So for example, in Montreal, if everyone had, or 97% of buildings on the island of Montreal had solar panels, we could save 957,000 tons of CO2 per year, which is like massive, right? And then like we could basically be completely self-sufficient. I mean, here we're on hydro electricity, which is pretty low carbon, so it's not the biggest issue. But in a lot of places that are high, like for example in Australia, they're almost entirely reliant on coal, and they have all this sun, right? So if you only like could predict what the best way of like interspersing solar panels are and connecting them and like making sure the energy travels, you could save a lot of CO2. And it's like it would be the equivalent in Montreal. It would be the equivalent of like removing 200,000 cars off the road for a year, which is massive. And actually, even on an individual level, for example, you can enter your address on a map. So this one is in California. This one doesn't exist in Montreal yet, the individual one, but exists in most of the US. So you can enter an address, and it's going to tell you how much usable sunlight per year you have and how much you can save by installing a solar panel on your roof. Which is like, you know, as a homeowner, it could be like huge savings. And so, and it also I don't know if you can see on the right of the image, it has like dark and light, and depending on how the panels are how the roof is located, like which direction the peak is and things like that, and like how much shade or sun it gets, it produces more or less electricity. So that's pretty cool. And this is all done completely with AI using satellite imagery, photographs, you know, at different times of day, and they basically like compare them and say, well, over the last year, this is how much you got. So because Google has all this crazy data, right, and they can do really, really cool things with it. So in this case, it's a really promising tool. In terms of farms and forests, so farms are actually like a huge carbon source. So basically, you can map carbon emissions emitted by farms, either by like for example, cows, or by the agriculture that they do, or by various things. So you can map their emissions in real time. You can do precision agriculture, which is essentially like, depending on the characteristics of a certain part of your land, even like a smaller part, you can say, oh, it has more humidity, less sun, so I'm going to plant this here, and then that there, and essentially like make sure that you're precisely doing agriculture in the right way. And you can actually use drones for planting seeds after that. Like once you figure out that, you know, mushrooms should be planted there and corn over there, you can use you can use drones to plant them. Also for forests, so forests are the opposite. They're a carbon sink, but sadly there's kind of there's danger to them. So for example, deforestation is a huge thing. There are, for example, there's projects like the Rainforest Connection that uses old cell phones, recycled cell phones, in order to monitor the sounds of the forest in real time. So basically using voice recognition, well, sound recognition essentially. And then they recognize like ambient sounds of the forest, like rain and animals and things like that. And then if they hear a chainsaw or something that's, you know, potentially dangerous, they'll trigger an alarm, and using the GPS of the phone, they can say, hey, like here in this part of the Amazon rainforest, there's deforestation happening in real time, which is like a crazy, great idea, right? So it's a project I really, really like. You can also plant seeds in forests. Like for example, after the Australian wildfires, they put out drones to plant seeds autonomously based on characteristics of the terrain. So basically, if there's a valley, you can plant more trees, or, you know, if it's near a river, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually do like afforestation in real time using drones, and it's a lot more scalable. There's what I call temporary fixes as well, because I'd rather people not focus on them as solutions to climate change, but CO2 removal, it is a certain potentially helpful application. So you can capture it from the air, and machine learning can help discover the right materials to do this, because currently we're not really sure what is best to be used. And also sequestration, which is actually like putting it underground and keeping it. And then also there, we need to figure out locations, and then also monitor them, and also figure out like whether we should keep them in, you know, liquid form, or or gas form, or what's the best way essentially to keep the carbon underground once we have it. So people are working on this. I think it's a good temporary solution. Of course, we should focus on it as like the solution to all our problems. Solar geoengineering is kind of what I mentioned before, is when you want to change the climate automatically. So basically, machine learning can help by modeling aerosols. So basically, a lot of people want to put aerosols in the sky, for example, to reflect sunlight and things like that. The machine learning can help, and you can also define targets using machine learning. So these are like two like pretty useful tools. And also in terms of societal impacts, like we don't think about it a lot, but in terms of adaptation, if there's a disaster that hits a certain zone, people will move, roads will get destroyed, bridges as well, bodies of water will move. If you want to get aid to that place, you have to know what happened. So in terms of humanitarian applications of AI linked to climate change, AI can help because, for example, you can, on one hand, you can predict a disaster happening, like for example, a tsunami or a hurricane, and you can respond faster. So for example, you can see which roads got wiped out by comparing the before and after. You can actually do predictions, like saying, well, you know, I have to get a truck to this specific village that got hit by a hurricane. This is the road that I'll take because all these other roads that are not available anymore, this is how long it's going to take as well. Or I have to use a helicopter because there's no roads anymore. You can also optimize resources. So in developing countries where they don't necessarily have, you know, enough water, you can have like water management in the long term, and you can model how much water will be replenished or not, and how much water people will need, and use that information in order to like help people be more sustainable. Sorry. Also, a project that I got involved in at Mila was analyzing media coverage of climate change. It's actually pretty interesting because we really found a big difference between left and right-wing coverage of climate change. So, for example, when you queried global warming of the model we made, you can see that on one hand, it's like claims of global warming or groundless, or, you know, things like that. And on the other hand, you have like human activity, consensus, left-wing articles saying, yeah, it's a scientific truth. So you really see how climate change and like various climate change related terms are really differently covered. We also created a calculator, which is called MLCO2. It's basically for machine learning practitioners in order to estimate how much CO2 they're producing. So based on the hardware they're using, how long they're using it for, what their provider is, and where, you can compute how many tons of CO2 you produced. So this is a pretty nifty tool. It's also on the web. And my main project, the one I'm working on, is called Personalized Visualizations of Climate Change. So there's actually a bunch of us. And the idea is allowing people to educate themselves regarding the effects of climate change in a personal and visual way in order to minimize the cognitive biases that I mentioned. So our goal is to be positive. So basically, it's not to scare people or to make them anxious, but to really say that, like, you know, they have an impact on the future. And that today's actions actually will impact the future based on scientific models like the ones I mentioned. And the idea is to create a website where you can enter an address and visualize your home after 50 or 100 years based on the effects of flooding, calculated based on climate models. So for example, this is an image of downtown LA, Los Angeles. And, you know, based on climate models, it's going to get wetter and hotter. You're going to have more flash storms and overwhelm the infrastructure. Sorry. And so you're going to have more of this. So this is basically our model. It takes the input image, it takes the prediction, and it generates an output image of basically like, hey, you guys are going to have more flooding than the infrastructure can handle. This is Jakarta. Jakarta is actually sinking, and they're moving the capital of Indonesia to another place just because Jakarta is so low lying. But this is an image of downtown Jakarta, and this is like almost like half a meter of flooding on average because it's sinking slowly, and then it's built kind of on a swamp, kind of like Venice, but less stilts. So Jakarta is sinking, and people are still building there. So if you show them this image and say, hey, like this is your street in 50 years, maybe you shouldn't build a new house here, right? So either the government can make that choice to move people, or people can make the choice not to build. This is downtown Montreal, old Montreal. I don't know if you recognize it, Rue Saint-Paul. And then since it's near the St. Lawrence, it can actually also get flooded, especially in the springtime when the snow melts and waters rise. So basically these are, approximations, because obviously it's really hard to say this given street in 2050 is going to look like this, but it's an idea essentially of like, hey, this is what's happening in the future. It's not Miami, it's not the Maldives, it's Montreal or Jakarta. And and then what you can do. So the idea is to create this website where you can have a slider, enter an address, and then see how that address will change. And then we're going to have a page where people can find out what they can do, how to reduce their carbon impact, to write a letter to their representative, things like that. So this is a work in progress. It should be live by the summer, if everything goes well. And so we're using generative adversarial networks, or GANs. So basically, based on images of before and after floods or before and after catastrophes, we can generate new images. So basically, like this horse to zebra. So based on a lot of images of horses and a lot of images of zebras, the model learns what constitutes this transformation. And so same thing with us. Based on a lot of images of before floods and after floods, our model can transform a new street that it's never seen before, like Montreal, for example. It can use what it's learned in order to make this transformation. And it learns essentially that the houses don't change that much, but the water is on the ground and things like that. So that's what our model is learning. So to top it all off, what can I do? What can you do? What can we do? My takeaway messages is that machine learning or AI, like all technology, is not guaranteed to make the world a better place, but I truly believe that it can. I believe that it can save the world. How you can get involved, learn, obviously. This is going to take all of us in order to solve this wicked problem. So we wrote a paper, but there's a lot of resources out there, depending on what your specialty is or what you want to get involved in. So identify how you can use your skills, any skills. Collaborate, because often we think that something is an issue, or we think that this is something that we should really concentrate ourselves on, when someone who's going to be working in, for example, I don't know, ecology or something, is going to say that, no, well, that's not really an issue, but this over here is. So find collaborators, researchers, entrepreneurs, companies, policymakers, figure out where the problems are. Listen. Listen to what they say and gather more input in order to make sense. Like before you start a project, gather as much input as possible, try to figure out something that really works and that can make an impact. And deploy, because despite all this, something is only going to have an impact if people are using it or if it's working somewhere, right? So don't be afraid to try things out, to prototype, to share, to, open source, and to make sure that the most impact can be realized. Thank you very much, and don't hesitate to reach out, and I hope you have a wonderful day here at Techmakers. Thanks.